Hello, I'd like to speak with you about two related authors and their contributions to the rise of the English novel. In the next few minutes, we'll be talking about Samuel Richardson, specifically his 1740 novel Pamela, and Henry Fielding's response with the parody, also of 1741, just a few months after Pamela was published, called Shamala, and his very different take on his own novel called Joseph Andrews. Now, these mid-18th century novelists have sharply different views on what a novel ought to accomplish, what it stands for, and how it contributes to public letters. Let's begin with Samuel Richardson. Now, I'll ask you also to watch a brief video that describes Richardson and how Richardson came to write this novel. It is a rather anomalous tale. Richardson, as you'll hear, was an experienced printer, had spent many years as an entrepreneur in the literary and printing business, and he had therefore had a good handle on what sold, what made money. In that respect, there's something common to both him and one of our earlier novelists, Daniel Defoe, who himself was an entrepreneur and tried his hand at many different things. Richardson didn't try his hand at many different things. He was a printer, but within the world of printing, he had access to see many different kinds of texts to know what worked, what was selling, what grabbed readers. The novel was still not a major form in 1740 when Richardson, at the not young age of 50, sat down to write his first novel, which became Pamela, Virtue Rewarded. As you can see here, both on the video page, as well from this lecturer's presentation, he claimed that after the novel came out, that he was inspired by a text about familiar letters. People were looking for a handbook on how to write letters to those of them to correspondents, interlocutors in their private life. People wanted to know how to write these kinds of letters. I find this significant. Let me pause it here, because what Richardson said inspired Pamela was a desire among the growing middle station, the forerunner of the middle class, to be able to express themselves to people in their lives in writing in a polite, proper, and clear manner, in a useful form. They wanted to know how to talk to people whom they knew on a familiar level through writing. In many respects, the novel itself can be seen as a kind of commentary on that. If you think for a moment about what that might mean, in order to be able to express oneself, to address oneself to another person in your life, a familiar person, in a way that bespeaks correctness, manners, politeness. That is exactly what is happening throughout this period, the end of Augustine, moving into what is sometimes called the Age of Sensibility, this middle of the 18th century, when regulating your manners, trying to act and think and feel correctly, is such a crucial element of what is happening in English culture. It is in many ways the success or the popularization of even what was right. It is the logical, and it's a logical next step in what had begun in The Spectator, with a more select, smaller group, but a growing group of people who are being educated in how to think. Richardson writes this text again at age 50, then 51, 1740. It is an enormous success in the end of 1740, in the early months of 1741. Some claim it is actually the first bestseller, the first smash hit, a sensation in its time, with all kinds of other spin-offs and other media pictures of this fictitious character, Pamela. The synopsis of it, you hear about it in the other video, as well as something I'll just share here. It is as the text is called, it is a text, Pamela, subtitle, Virtue Rewarded, from a beautiful young damsel to her parents. It is written as a series of epistolary texts. It's in an epistolary form. That's the technique that Richardson develops to write this novel. You have immediate access to the character's mindset, primarily Pamela herself. She is a 15-year-old maid in a not upper class, but a wannabe aristocrat, someone a few stations above her in the British class system, Mr. B, as he is called, who subjects her to repeated, what we would call sexual harassment. A man of a much higher station, of much greater power. Her employer wants to have sex with her. She restrains and she resists over and over again, not physically necessarily, but eventually he can't bring himself to force her to actually rape her, and their colloquy, their dialogue, Mr. B and Pamela, eventually brings them to fall in love with each other, and there is the happy ending. Now this text, which is, as you can see here, this is as you can see on one side of our page, and it's just an expanded version of what you can see in the first edition from the British Library. Let's look at that title page. There are a few things I want to draw out, beyond what you've already heard. Virtue Rewarded, in a series of familiar letters from a beautiful young damsel to her parents, now fully published. You're getting this. There's the novel gives the sense that you are getting a intimate view of this person in a vulnerable position. The maid. There are many maids, servants in this era. I guess it's before we get to orphans. Another key paragon, stock character. Servants are someone who are in other people's houses, are themselves, they need to make money in order to survive, but have access to they're in other people's households. And the novel, the epistolary version, the epistolary form here gives one access to their minds. It also says very clearly this is meant to be virtue rewarded. It is meant to cultivate the principles of virtue and religion in the minds of youth and both sexes. It is a clear, stated, explicit, didactic purpose. It also says, and this might be a little harder for you to read, a narrative, I'll try to expand it here, a narrative which has its foundation in truth. It doesn't say that it actually happened, but it has its foundation in truth and in nature. So this is supposedly realistic. And at the same time, that is arguably entertained by variety in curious and affecting incidents. So it is meant to exemplify virtue. It is meant to be real, drawn from reality and nature, as well as to be entertaining through these incidents that will be exposed through the text, through these letters. This is the book of common letters that inspired the text. This handbook of 173 letters that cover the gamut of common concerns of human life. This is the familiar letters handbook that inspired Pamela, including very famously of the 173 letters, number 138 is a father to a daughter who is in service, a servant daughter, on hearing that her master is attempting to take advantage of her virtue. He's attempting to make her sleep with him. My dear daughter, and this is what I understand with great grief of heart. That is the scenario, of course, of Pamela. That is precisely what happens here. Virtue, what is the virtue that is rewarded? It's been clearly stated. Her virginity, she protects her chastity. And yet also the virtue that's rewarded is she's able to reform Mr. B. Pamela is such a winsome, such a good person that he eventually complies with her and is brought into a into wedlock, into a proper relationship, into an honorable relationship. The success of this text, of teaching virtue, teaching that religious value of protecting virgin bodies, young women's bodies, virtue learned, and all this comes, these are religious values that are being taught by this socially mobile, she's poor but wants to work her way up, this very winsome, adorable, pleasant 15-year-old teenager, this servant girl, this dutiful daughter as well as servant. She's a maid. She says, "O sir, my soul is of equal importance with the soul of a princess, though my quality is inferior to that of the meanest slave." Two things I want to emphasize in that. It's a quote from midway through the novel. One, it's, again, as with Robinson Crusoe, the focus on the lower stations, the ordinary people of English society who replace the epic characters of the princesses, of the elite, of the gods, and so on, in epic. But her quality is inferior to that of the meanest slave, that she feels that she is as constricted as that of a slave. Second, she is the emblem or the source of this lesson in virtue. It's not a Pilgrim's Progress, it's not an allegory necessarily about Christianity, but it teaches from this secular, sensational story the religious values that were meant to be communicated. This text comes in for harsh criticism by what has been called the anti-Pamelists, people who ridicule it. There are many more people who loved it, and there are all kinds of over-the-top, exaggerated, but there are actual stories of people reading the book, and you can hear some of them. The leading anti-Pamelist was Henry Fielding. Henry Fielding, right away, in just a matter of months, and this is part of what is so piquant and interesting about this period, is how quickly and how intense this culture of letters and writing and literature was. Henry Fielding, someone who did set out to be a novelist, to be a writer, he also wrote stage. He was also a playwright and a very accomplished essayist, and someone who had given a lot more thought to what novels were, and that's what we'll finish with in another second. He writes this parody, this savage parody, satire of Pamela, in which, as you can see here, he purports to write, and here's the cover page of the apology for the life of Miss Shamala Andrews. Her real name is, her real name is Shamala, so then she had been misnamed in the other book, the false book, as Pamela, and she is exposed. And refused, and all the matchless arts of that young politician. Okay, what happens here? This parody purports to be telling the truth of what Pamela, we'll call her Shamala, what Shamala is really like, and it is trying to pull back the curtain by saying that Pamela is actually very unrealistic. There's no one as virtuous. The whole premise of what that drives Pamela, Richardson's Pamela, of this girl refusing her sexuality, maintaining her chastity and virginity, that basic premise of the text is false. For Shamala is really a very scheming young woman. Let's look at a little bit of what is in Pamela. Excuse me. Here it is, towards the end here. And it also maintains this epistolary form, but the actual letters, not the censored and Baldwin's and rewritten letters that Fielding's satire claims. Fielding doesn't put his name on this book, by the way, as you can see. He says it's written by Connie Caber, the con artist. But Shamala writes to her mother. Her mother is a prostitute. "Oh, what news since I writ my last. The young squire has been here, and as sure as a gun, he hath taken a fancy to me. Pamela, says he, for so I am called here, not Shamala, her real name, you was a great favorite of your late mistresses. Yes, and please your honor, says I, and I believed you deserved it, says he. Thank your honor for your good opinion, says I. And then he took me up by the hand, and I pretended to be shy. laws as I hope you don't intend to be rude, right? Of course, she wants to lead him on. She's just pretending. She's being rather coy. She's pretending to be shy, as opposed to in Pamela, which you can see now on the screen, where the text is really one of, it begins with the death of Mr. B's mother, and this leads to extraordinary fear and panic by Pamela. She's not sure what, she's aware that she's now vulnerable, but she still needs the job. She needs the money, and she's already fearful in that first letter and the second letter, the reply from the father, that she will be exploited by, as indeed happens, by the new master. What is Fielding doing? Fielding is saying a number of things. First of all, that it is not real, that this entire text of virtue, the didactic element, is always going to be a fiction, meaning not a fiction that we want to believe in, but it's going to be preposterous. And I want to mention now, as we're coming to the end of this video, a few things. First, the relationship of the parody, the satire, to the experimental text that was Richardson's Pamela. Similar, by the way, to what happened with Defoe's experimental work, Robinson Crusoe, the breakout text of his, followed shortly thereafter by Jonathan Swift's savage subversion and satire of it in Gulliver's Travels. But Fielding has also, just as with Swift, very principled opposition. It's not real. The emotions, as well as this didactic emphasis on virtue, is false. And in fact, what he does is, and this is another thing that's fascinating here, is Fielding, writing in a few years writing in another novel, a few years after, only a short number of years after Pamela and then Shamala. You can see, by the way, that Pamela's name she's from the Andrews family, Pamela Andrews. Her parents are John and Elizabeth Andrews. And Fielding writes an entire novel called Joseph Andrews. Joseph Andrews is a book that's entirely by Fielding. The Adventures of Joseph Andrews and his friend Mr. Abram Adams. Joseph Andrews is also a servant. And you can see on the cover page here, on the title page, it is written in imitation of the manner of Cervantes. Not a text that many of you probably have written, but we all should. Fascinating and important, perhaps the first European novel in Spanish by Cervantes, Don Quixote, a picaresque novel, a novel that takes the romance, brings it into a completely different realm, draws the epic and puts it into this as we call it, quixotic figure. And in the introduction, that's on the title page. In the introduction, the preface to Joseph Andrews, there's a few. The first quote at the top, as you can see here, is from the preface to Joseph Andrews. That Fielding is consciously thinking about the existing forms of literature in the European tradition, the epic and the drama. Texts that you've all read and you are familiar with from having read them in historical backgrounds and the Renaissance studies with when drama became the key form of the day. What the novel ought to do, Fielding thinks, is to combine these two, to find a way that is not divided between tragedy and comedy, but rather combining tragedy and comedy. He calls it a comic epic. That is what Cervantes innovated, and Fielding, wishes to do in the English context, to try to have as much significance, but also as much accessibility or pertinence. This is from an aside for part 4 of the novel, and I have quoted from it here. But to return to the former class, who are contented to copy nature. Now, if we want to be really faithful to nature, people aren't all good, nor are people all bad, as actually some of Defoe's later novels seem to suggest. But people, if you want to copy nature and make it compelling and accurate and sincerely, authentically realistic, we need to, let's read what he has to say here. Instead of forming originals from the confused heap of matter in their own brains, all the duties of a king are summed up in a universal fatherly care of this people. I declare here once for all that I describe not men, but manners, not an individual, but a species. If we really want to be authentic, we need to focus on the behaviors, not creating some story, not just creating some scenario. And that's why I think it's significant that he's drawing this character, Joseph Andrews. He's lifting him out of the family tree of Pamela, the Andrews family of Richardson's Pamela. But he's saying, I'm focused on not one individual, but the way that humans act, on manners. Let's finish the quote. Perhaps what we answered, are not the characters then taken from life? To which I will answer, yes. I have not created any of these characters. They're all the products of my observation. Any of you who are fiction writers know how prevalent, how influential that way of thinking is. That I haven't created anything. I'm just stitching together various observations that I've taken from actual life, from what I see around me. So the observation, which actually comes from Locke and the Enlightenment, the power of observing as the litmus test for what is true, observing, is here introduced into the novel, and is here also given a kind of philosophical backing that this is what is true. What is true is how people behave, not the sensational story, because nothing really, Joseph Andrews, like Don Quixote, is just one event after another. It's picaresque is the term that we use, Picaresque, and it is not something that he invents, but really just describes. Last thing about this. Now, there are some elements of that, the technology, the techniques that are used here, referring in Fielding's case to existing literary forms. Richardson using those letters. I want to amplify what I've mentioned here in two final points. One, are these characters meant to be real, or do people, the readers, understand themselves through the prism of these characters? In other words, in the debate between Fielding and Richardson, Fielding's attack on Richardson for not actually offering a realistic portrait of humanity, are the emotions of the fictional characters real emotions? Is, when people read Pamela, and some people still do, swoon over her romance with Mr. B, is that because they feel that same emotions, they feel that same kind of love, and they can, and they have, it's a sort of it's a catharsis through it, or is it the stylized, artificial version of what a girl who is in our world, we would call it, exposed to intense sexual harassment and yet withstands it, and indeed even reforms the harasser? Is that actually all just the stylized construction of the 50-year-old man, of the author? Pamela is the creation of a man who wants to give an image of what it is to be in that situation. Not that a man couldn't. I'm just saying, I'm just wondering, is it truly successful? The rise of the novel tracks the rise of the individual self in Europe, in Britain. And was the novel actually expressing what people were starting to feel when they had this sense of individuality that emerged over the 18th century? Or is it an instrument in shaping that individuality, telling you what it is to be a person, to be a servant, to be a member of this growing and upwardly mobile, in general, society? That's the first part, about realism, about the actual emotions, about those manners. There is so much emphasis in the 18th century on manners, on trying to act correctly, on trying to be passable, and literature, writing, how you wrote, indeed, those letters to your familiars, to your own intimate people in your own life, was a way of shaping, of channeling, of sort of dressing yourself. What I'm constantly reminded of is Professor Kohlbrenner's point that those energies, and as he called it, the enthusiasms of the previous century, the 17th century, the 1600s, are constantly coming up. And while so much of the repression of trying to act correctly, trying to speak correctly, trying to write correctly of the 18th century, and trying to keep that sort of people entertained and enlightened, as well as instructed properly, the whole apparatus of everything that we're reading in the 18th century is so powerful, and yet at times it just seems completely artificial. And that is what happens also in these debates of the attacks of Swift on Defoe, of Fielding on Richardson, these forms of art that are turning in on themselves. Defoe just looking for something that works, Richardson knowing a little bit about what works and having a sense of these letters are going to be something powerful. Writing is built on other forms of, and also, by the way, Fielding also saying explicitly, acknowledging his debt to Cervantes and to the classical forms, which is part of, by the way, the Augustan tradition, recreating those classical forms, citing Aristotle as he does. Writing, turning in on itself, these cycles of parody, of comedy and realism, finding the human moment through the literary. Okay, that's it for that. I hope that some of that made sense, and we'll catch up in the next recording.